So, hi class, let me begin. This is Michael Knock again on nuclear security. As we move toward the midpoint of the class semester, we start to introduce some guest speakers into the syllabus. Each one is an expert in their area, and we're really very delighted to have them all to really enrich the whole course content. Today, we're starting off with Brad Roberts, longtime friend and colleague of myself and many of us. Brad is the director of the Center for Global Security Research, CGSR, at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. He's a Stanford undergrad, did graduate work at the LSE in London, and then did a PhD at Erasmus University in the Netherlands. He's been at several major think tanks in Washington. He was at the Congressional Research Service, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he was also editor of the Washington Quarterly, and the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. He joined the Obama administration in early 2009 and became the key leader of the Nuclear Posture Review and the Ballistic Missile Defense Review, and was very much the leading advocate of its recommendations and conclusions in countries around the world, particularly with our European and Asian allies. After he finished a term with the Obama administration, he went to Tokyo for a while, where he was at a major think tank of the self-defense forces. And then he returned to Stanford. We completed a book, which is part of your required reading, on the case for nuclear weapons, US nuclear weapons in the 21st century. And then after that book was completed, he joined Lawrence Livermore Lab, where he's been for over 5 years. He's built up a tremendous program of workshops and seminars, and he's published a lot of stuff himself and supported many other monographs on all aspects of nuclear weapons technology and policy. So it's a great honor to have him here. And Carl Van Bibber is going to tell us how he's going to steer the conversation today on wargaming in the Baltics.
Great.
Carl?
Thank you, Professor Knock. Just to back up one step, this week, both today and Wednesday, are going to be, these two classes are going to be dedicated to preparing and doing the groundwork for you to begin engaging in the Capstone Project in earnest. And the Capstone Project deals with this most interesting component of the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, which was setting out the importance of developing a submarine launch cruise missile and also a modified, which has come to pass, a W-76 Mod 2, which could be rapidly deployed, a very low yield nuclear weapon, to provide more of immediate rejoinder to in the case of the Russians and also the Chinese, a very large number, a very large suite of flexible low yield weapons, tactical weapons that could be used to threaten or could be actually used in in actual aggressive action in the future. It occurred to us talking amongst ourselves, Professor Knock, Mansuk, Jake, and Aaron, that this capstone could end up being very theoretical and not well informed unless you first really had a very good grasp of what are these things from a technical point of view. And I think Jake is at some point going to take an opportunity in maybe one of the sessions to actually describe what these systems are in terms of their yield, in terms of their range and delivery, the differences between them, and whether their robustness against air defense systems and so forth. But more importantly, how does the existence of low yield weapons in the hands of our adversaries, as either as a threat or as something which would be actually operationally used, change the course of envisioned conflicts that we may be faced with. And conversely, which comes to the point of the Capstone project, what limited capabilities of the same kind that we would have could change the course of how events evolve in the case of an actual conflict. And therefore, putting it all together for you as a class to make an assessment, what is the deterrence value of adding these back into the US armamentum from the nuclear point of view? About 3 or 4 years ago, I had the privilege, and Professor Nock was there too, of taking part in a war game, what's called in the business, a tabletop exercise, a 2-step tabletop exercise over 2 days at Livermore, involving a very large number. Brad will remind me, I think it was about 150 or so, of really expert players. They were senior military officers in the Pentagon, people in the sort of the combatant commands, deeply experienced warfighters, analysts, people from the laboratory, people involved in nonproliferation, and intelligence personnel and so forth, where Brad laid out a scenario and then showed how it evolves on day one. The teams then had to develop a coordinated response on behalf of the US plus NATO. It's a Baltic State scenario. Day two, what is the next step in the case that the scenario presents with us, and the response there. Now, with the possibility or the option of having low yield weapons that could be used on behalf of the US or NATO, how does that potentially, either their use or the possibility of their use, change the future course of events, of how an adversary may decide to play their hand, and therefore what ultimately would be the deterrence value of these things if we had them. So I thought it would be useful to focus the mind for Brad to give us a summary of what that scenario was, explain how it plays out. And I think that will actually focus your thinking, and these things will not be simply theoretical, but actually have a very practical, sort of a practical imprint on your mind and your thinking as you do your capstone exercise. So without further ado, I'm just going to let Brad take it, describe this scenario, and you can ask questions as we go along. Brad.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to both of you for the opportunity. Thanks to all of you for your interest. I'm happy to take the conversation in any direction that would be of interest. I thought what I'd do is just start with a few words about the particular values and limits of tabletop exercises. And then I talk a bit about the experience of 4 years ago, but then walk you through an update to the scenario and through some of the main questions. And I think this will give you a framework that you can return to as you do the capstone. And I'm happy to continue the discussion along the way with those who might be interested. A few comments about tabletop exercises. There are essentially two types. And if in the item I sent around late last week, I suggested one possible item for reading, an essay by Ivanka Barjaska in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists on how to turn a vogue into science. Wargaming is a maturing art. And it needs to become more scientific to become to live up to its full potential for us. But there are essentially two types. One war game is basically experiential. It's for the player in order to be exposed to the experience, the pressures of decisions, the need for information, the short timelines, the functioning of the interagency process. It's educative, and its purpose is to sensitize people to something, not necessarily to expose them to particular knowledge. The second type is more scientific and analytical. It's constructed in order to gain insights into a particular topic or problem And if repeated, if conducted over multiple iterations, it's designed to provide cumulative insight into a set of questions. And wargaming, as it's been practiced, has been mostly the first type and not much the second. And that has left us shorthanded conceptually. Second important point about wargaming and techniques and TTXs is that there are essentially two levels of analysis. Some war games focus on the tactical and operational level of war. This is what wargaming was created for in the first place. If I can incorporate this new technology here, how will it affect my tactic? And how will that affect the overall flow on the battlefield? And will it help me win? Tactical and operational. That's different from strategic. At the strategic level, what you're gaming is decision making. If I do X, Y will happen over there. But Z might happen, and I got to worry about that. And I might expect to pay a cost. I have to factor that into this equation too. So I had suggested that you might look at the joint operating concept on deterrence for the purpose of familiarizing yourself with that deterrence calculus, the calculus of benefits, costs, and risks of different courses of action. That's the strategic level of conflict that wargaming is trying to get better at mapping out and understanding, particularly as we face adversaries today, armed with nuclear weapons and capable of significant escalation to defend their interest if they so choose. So I said there are two types of war games, two levels of analysis. I'm sticking with twos. There are also generally two moves in these TTXs. The first is intended to compel the players to choose a strategy. And the second move compels the players to react to the partial success and partial failure of the strategy. So you get to test your ideas and make some adjustments. In the scenario that I've handed to you, let's see, sorry, I'm looking at my notes here. In the scenario that I've handed to you, I've tried to, well, this is an updated version of the scenario we used 4 years ago. I updated it for a couple of reasons. One to just set it into a new framework with more contemporary information, and essentially every document referred to, every statement attributed to somebody in the background section of the scenario exists. These are all real. This always leads players to say yes, but that's not really real, or that wouldn't have happened that way, or we've misinterpreted that, or that's called fighting the scenario. Please don't fight the scenario. Everybody would write the scenario somewhat differently, because the point isn't actually to understand who wins and who loses. Tabletop exercises are about understanding some topic, problem, issue, decision point, and their value is not in knowing who won, because there are so many variables that go into real outcomes that they can't be all played out. If we were actually playing this tabletop exercise, you wouldn't have seen 90% of what I gave you last week. What you would have gotten as a read ahead was the March 2024 political assessment, military assessment. So pages 2, 3, 4. You would sit down, we would meet, we'd have some coffee, we'd eat some cake or something, and then sit down at the table broken into usually 2 or 3 or 4 teams, and you'd be handed the information from move 1, which you would digest on the spot. The 2 or 3 or 4 teams would be roughly speaking, the good guys, the bad guys, the friends of the good guys, meaning US allies, and then the white cell, or the white team, or the adjudicators. This is the final team. Because the gameplay isn't exactly iterative, which is to say, red doesn't play and then go drink coffee while blue plays, and then blue goes and drinks coffee while red plays. No, all the teams play at the same time, and then somebody has to figure out what happened. That's the job of the adjudicators. The adjudicators also get instructions from the organizers. I want you to adjudicate this game so that, well, I was in one game last year in which I was playing the Russian leader. And our decision was to employ 3 nuclear weapons against NATO targets, one of which was a logistics center at the main airport in Frankfurt. If you've ever flown into Frankfurt Airport, on the north side of the runway is a US military base, and it's a logistics center. We had that in mind for a Russian low-yield weapon. But the adjudicators were instructed to take every opportunity to escalate the conflict out of a decision made by one of the teams. So the adjudicators, we came back in for move 2. They handed out the result, and they're one of the 3 Russian nuclear weapons had gone smack into the middle of Dresden, killed 6 million people. And this was because the adjudicators have been told to escalate the conflict when they could. So understand that if you're ever in a real tabletop exercise, that the adjudicators too have instructions that shape the play of the game. But in the real game, you'd sit down and you'd then read through move 1, and you'd come to the team play question, where you're told you're a member of some group, and in this case, an interagency team chaired by the National Security Advisor and tasked by the president to give me, the president, or for us to give the president some options in 4 hours. This is part of the reality of crisis management in the real world. You don't have time to gather a lot of data. You don't have time to deliberate. You sit at a table with a bunch of people from other parts of the federal government and military, and you decide, and you make recommendations on the spot. And what you might know tomorrow is irrelevant. So the first question is always, so what do you think is going on? Is Putin getting ready to launch a war against NATO, or is this just more provocative stuff aimed at causing Westerners to be divided and fearful? What military actions would you recommend at this time, if any? What political actions would you recommend? How can we show them that we really mean it, while also showing that we're willing to find a solution if he is as well? That is a question that always absorbs a great deal of time. How do you send these 2 different messages that are seemingly inconsistent? What risks are involved? You may be able to project costs. If I do this to the Russians now, they're likely to do this back to me now. But what's the risk that something might get out of control, or that your adversary might act in some way that's contrary to your interests? And then an important question always is, of course, how do you rate the risks of nuclear employment by the adversary in a conflict? So your capstone project is about determining whether an hypothesis in the Trump administration's nuclear posture review is valid or not. The hypothesis being that the absence of a supplemental low-yield option is a critical weakness in the defense posture, and with the fielding of supplemental capabilities, the US and its NATO allies can be confident that Russia would be deterred from regional aggression and nuclear use in the war if it were to occur. Has everyone had a chance to read the scenario? Do you want to just take 3 minutes to read the scenario, refresh your understanding of move one? I see a number of heads going up and down.
Good idea.
So let's just give you 3 minutes to do pages 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we'll come to the question on page 7. Okay, what do you think? Okay. So bear in mind that in real gameplay, you wouldn't have seen anything of move 2. And you'd be trying to figure out how to shape thinking in Moscow so that so that what's happening here stops without further escalation. And it turns out to be just another set of provocations aimed at Mr. Putin trying to impress his public with his strength, but not risking war. And to influence that calculus, the well, to understand the calculus, you have the input from the intelligence assessment that says pretty much what we know to be true, which is that if Putin ever made this decision, he'd be seated at a table with one or two people in uniform, but a small group of political advisors. And they have different views on these questions. But those who might think that nuclear employment or creating a direct threat to a vital interest of a US ally, a NATO member, those who might think that do so on the belief that the West is a, quote, nuclear paper tiger, a statement attributed to some Russian leaders, and that the employment of nuclear weapons would sober and not, and nuclear weapons could be employed by Russia against NATO in a manner that would sober but not enrage Western publics. The underlying idea here is that in a war between Russia and NATO, from Russia's perspective, Russia's interests in the outcome of that war are vital. They're core interests of the regime of Russia and of the state of Russia, because if they lose, the integrity of the Russian state may be in question. Whereas for NATO, whereas for the United States, the interests at risk are very important, but they're the interests of its allies, not of itself. And thus, some believe that they can employ nuclear weapons to sober us, that is to awaken us to this asymmetry of stake. And they can do so with very low yield weapons, so they won't enrage us, generating and putting political pressure then on our leaders to react with a very large strike back on the Russian homeland. And the question here, would a new low yield capability in the hands of the United States or NATO make a difference to that calculus in Moscow? Would they see, and the argument is that the likelihood of an American response to a Russian strike with limited nuclear weapons in Europe, the likelihood of an American response is lower if all the United States has is big, high-yield weapons that can attack the Russian state and society. And the threshold to Russian use is higher if what NATO has is the ability to employ a small number of weapons in a limited way on Russian forces that are operating in Western Europe. So what do you make of those arguments? How would you see the risks of nuclear war in this circumstance, and what do you think of our ability to influence the Russian calculus by nuclear and maybe other means? Who would like to jump into the conversation?
I have a question on the scenario. So in your notes, you say that Russia is interested in forming a land bridge through Lithuania to Kaliningrad. Are they going through Latvia or Belarus? And what is the status of the non-Russian states? I don't think the United States would use any nuclear weapons against not Russia.
Well, you picked up an ambiguity in the scenario, and that's reality. There are some things that are left in here purposefully ambiguous. It's unclear where they're operating, where they intend to create that land bridge. The fog of war is real in games as it is real in war. So you're right, that would be an important distinction.
I'm asking because I think we have a better relationship with Latvia than Belarus. So I was just curious if where you could actually expand targets. That was all.
Right. So the availability of targets that are, that pass the political filter first, that's a constraining factor here on our use of nuclear options in Europe to shape Russian behavior. I mean, for NATO, it comes down to a question: do you nuke your own territory because there are Russian forces operating on it? Do you nuke your neighbor, or do you nuke the bases in Russia from which they operated? And if you're going to do that, if you're going to do those things, do you do them with local NATO forces, the fighter bombers with the B-61 bomb, or do you do them with US strategic systems? But your point is a very important one about the availability of targets that are going to fit into your political strategy. Who else would like to comment or question?
And Brad, let me follow up a little bit on that. I'm remembering back to the game 4 years ago, and I must confess, I forgot whether you told us that this was in fact historical reality or whether it was simply part of the framework of that game. About in 2014, the Duma declared that the three Baltic states were in fact part of sovereign Russian territory. Was that is that a historical reality, or is that no? Okay, but that was part of the last game.
It was. I took it out as not really plausible.
Okay.
I mean, that's clearly a declaration of war, and then here in Move One, it's a little less clear.
Right.
It's meant to be more ambiguous. No, what Mr. Putin has said, when asked to explain his statement about why the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union, which he said in 2007, I believe, and I think it was in 2008 at the Munich Security Conference, he said that the tragedy of the collapse of the Soviet state was that it left the Russian diaspora that had been sprinkled around the Soviet Union, left large Russian minority-speaking peoples in newly independent states where the states themselves were antagonistic to the presence of the Russian-speaking minorities. And he stated that it was his intent to defend Russian-speaking peoples wherever they stand, if ever they were coming under persecution and attack by their fellow citizens. So it wasn't quite a declaration of war on specific states, but it was a clear statement of intent to act militarily in defense of Russian-speaking peoples. And I should add, Carl, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, finish your thought, but I just wanted to point, I just saw in the chat that Jesus has raised his hand, but finish your thought.
My thought is just I failed to note that the game of 4 years ago was structured not to get first and foremost at the nuclear question. It was to get at the multi-domain character of the conflict and to assess whether and how the fact that there was competition in cyberspace and outer space and missile defense and conventional strike and all of those things, to assess how much that complicated the escalation and de-escalation problem. Did it make nuclear escalation more likely or nuclear escalation less likely? And unfortunately, the conclusion was it made it more likely. So I see hands up from Spiro and Jesus. I think Spiro's up first, given the sequence in which they appear on the box here, but whoever goes first is fine by me.
I think I had my hand up first for a while.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
So, yeah, so I want to bring up the perspective of, or opinion of, well, if we're going to approve low yield weapons, we want to, from my perspective, only use them on neighboring territories and not directly at the Russian nation to prevent a cascade of retaliation. So I want to bring that up to the table and see if there's any perspective that will want to challenge or give more insight on that.
So if we had someone here from, well, let's take Mansuk's case to use an example. Let's say you're South Korea. You've been attacked by the North. The Northern forces are on your territory. And a lot of people dead, but you managed to beat them back. Do you stop at the border?
maybe
Well,
not.
you have to pause and think on that one, don't you? Because if you stop at the border, well, they could turn around and do it again tomorrow. And they've paid no price at all, other than the soldiers lost on the battlefield. But the North Korean state goes on unpunished. Can you live in a world in which nuclear aggression goes unpunished? I don't know, but I think to me it's the answer to the question you pose, Jesus. It's an excellent question, and the answer is going to be not obvious in an alliance where different members of the alliance accept different risks by not attacking Russia. The Poles would absolutely say, of course you attack Russia, because if you don't attack Russia, they're going to be back here in 2 years, 5 years, or 30 years, but they're going to be back.
So with that perspective, I would want to bring up that how can we integrate intelligence in the Russian domain of weighing how much they're more likely to retaliate if once we're going to take in that consideration to attack their land.
Right. So in a real interagency meeting, you, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for strategic stability, would turn to the CIA representative and say, could you give us an assessment of your thinking? I mean, give us your thinking on this question. And they would have to do it off the top of their head at the table. So lots of hands have gone up. Spiro, you were next. Jesus, I know you're not finished, but let's get some other voices in.
Yeah, that's good for now for me.
Thanks.
So I was thinking with one issue with the low yield nuclear weapons is because the line of the battlefield because Russia and the US don't have a national border, and because the line of the battlefield borders one of the two main nuclear powers, if we drop a nuke, like a low yield nuclear weapon, onto the Russian homeland, because the line of the battlefield isn't near there, it could most likely lead to a more retaliatory response with larger nuclear weapons because we attacked their homeland, but for them to come back, it would lead to a larger, more attack on our homeland, since it wouldn't be another just volleying about the line of the battlefield, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. But then you're stuck. So how then do we influence Russian leadership not to undertake the escalatory actions that we fear in Move 1?
I think then it would have to be to either threaten with a larger force than the lower yield nuclear weapons, or go more towards a kind of not weapons approach, but more kind of like military, not military approach, but more of a psychological approach with something maybe involving more like a Crimea situation or something like that. But that could lead to a multifaceted area, actually.
Yeah, I mean, part of the answer is, can we rely on other tools? Are there other incentives we can give the Russians not to escalate? Are there places where we can compromise with them on something that's tolerable to us, even if not our preferred outcome? And in the military domain, are there other means of inflicting punishment on Russia that don't invite nuclear retaliation? So we currently have no long-range missile that doesn't have nuclear weapons on top of it. Would we be better off if we had some long-range missiles with conventional warheads on top? That would be more credible to threaten. Would it affect their thinking? Well, nobody really knows. Let's see. I think, Daniel, you were up next.
Yeah, hi. Okay, thank you. So I have a lot of many thoughts about this, so excuse me if it takes a minute to articulate some of what I'm thinking. But I think looking at Russia's motivation to use a low yield warhead to deter us from their end goals, which are up to question. But if it's what Putin is saying, then it's to protect the Russian diaspora that like, probably on paper, you can tell actually suffered a lot of consequences from the fall of the USSR, just because of reduced stability in government infrastructure and other like support systems. And like the US is among a few of the like imperialist states from colonial times that have not received that sobering wake-up call that Russia is saying a nuclear attack on the US would show us. And I would hope that we, in determining if we even want to use nuclear weapons or not, know that it's something that like we don't want to employ and we don't want anyone else to employ. And at, like, to that end, seek different ways, but still keeping in mind that the reality is that there is a threat, because Japan suffered their slap on the wrist with 2 nukes from us. We've already shown that like we will go to that point. I don't see any reason why we can't just pose an asymmetric threat, either somehow directly to Russian officials or to like the larger people. I think some sort of threat or just being clear and standing our ground and saying like, if you use a nuclear warhead, like we have historic precedent to just drop one on your capital or a major city. We can declare anything a military target apparently, and just bomb it. And hopefully that's deterrence enough, if not for Putin himself, then cyber security campaigns or whatever to influence and tell the diaspora the truth that like we don't want to bomb you. Your administration is doing things that are damaging or whatever. And have the people themselves, have them change their own leadership in whatever way they can. There has to be like an upswell to change a lot of the things that have got us to this point.
But Daniel, we already don't want to bomb them. They are well aware that we don't want a nuclear war. And the people don't have power over their government because Putin has pulled it from under their feet. So I'm not sure I understand the base of your argument.
I think what Daniel has said here that is very, very poignant, maybe not about imperialism, but is that no one has thought to actually call up the non-Russian states, Belarus and Latvia, and ask them what their position is, because it looks bad if we bomb Russia, right? It's gonna cause problems. It's gonna look really bad if we bomb not Russia. That would be bad. I mean, these are people. I mean, I'd like to know what the status is. I think personally, if I was in charge here, I'd call up Latvia and what's it?
Belarus.
Yes, Belarus, and say like, hey, you have some Russians outside your border. Are you going to allow them to come in and form a land bridge? In which case, you are actively doing some bad stuff, and you will, make yourself a target. Or are you going to ask for help and tell them to, stay out? Because I think that is an important bit of political calculus and actually deciding what to do. Not just, are these weapons going to do anything, but what are these weapons going to do? I think that is a very poignant follow up from what Daniel was saying. Daniel,
So
is that fair?
let me get Mike Santos and Greg Rose in, and then come back on a couple of points. But Mike, you're next.
Thank you. I'm more of a question. I'm wondering what the cutoff. I know there's not necessarily a concise technical definition for low yield, but in my mind, low yield and the way the Russians would employ it might be a high yield weapon. And in this strategy, could a high yield weapon be used in this escalate to de-escalate in the same way, just depending on where the target is or what the target is? So I'm a little confused on why the focus is on low yield when it really seems historically nuclear weapons have been used for a all-out attack. Whereas here, does it matter that it's low yield? Would that make a big difference? Or is it they only used one or they only used two and it doesn't matter what type of nuclear weapon it is?
Well, that's an excellent question. And the answer is it sort of depends. on the circumstance, what factors are significant. But to be clear, low yield is still giant yield. I mean, the weapons we're talking about are weapons of the size that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These are so-called low yield weapons. So they are less high yield, which means they may generate significantly less, depending on how they're employed, significantly less collateral damage. Surely you've studied by now the fact that if the fireball touches the earth, you loft a lot of ash and soil and debris into the atmosphere, and that's what becomes radioactive and falls downwind. But if so, a low yield weapon can be employed in a way that has very limited collateral effect, even if it's still high yield relative to anything. Another argument made about why the low yield weapons mattered wasn't really about their yield at all. It was about the delivery system. NATO has had the ability to deliver nuclear weapons against Soviet forces and now Russian forces at any time of its choosing in time of war. That capability is steadily being closed out as Russia fields more and more modern integrated air and missile defenses. And the fighter bombers that are currently counted upon to penetrate into Russian territory will not be able to penetrate in some period of time ahead. And so the preferred solution would be a stealthy cruise missile, which isn't going to be based on the territory of Western European nations. So it has to be based at sea. So the proposal has been for a sea-launched cruise missile. But because that would take 10 years to develop, then let's go with the low-yield ballistic missile option first, because that's available and certain to penetrate to the target. So there are multiple arguments for the so-called low-yield option. Greg, let me get you in and then open up the discussion a little bit. Greg Rose.
Yeah.
Oh,
We got a bad signal from you. No, we're not getting your signal.
Maybe type it out in the chat.
So we're not getting the content of your message. Sorry. Can you mute up again? We can try again in a few minutes. See if your signal's improved.
We asked a couple questions.
Well, we lost the signal altogether, I think. So this discussion, how are we doing on time? This discussion is so far done what Move One discussions usually do. You jump all over the topic. You move around, you look at it from one perspective and another perspective, and you hope you have the opportunity to answer different questions. You know, like what might I have done a year earlier to prevent this crisis from erupting? But you're stuck with the circumstance you've got. And I really haven't heard any particular discussion of whether there's something we need to do with our Western nuclear posture at this point in the game to shape the outcomes. And that's logical because it's because the situation in Moscow is murky. If it were clear that they all believed one thing, then we would try and influence that view. But I think what would result in Move One in the real world on this is NATO would be paralyzed. There's not enough clarity from Russia of what's to happen, that NATO could choose how to act, and it would be in deliberation, and Russia would be reading that as a sign of weakness and division. And so then we'd move on to move 2. And let me just take you to move 2, where clearly there's been a change in Russian strategy, where, or the full implementation of the previously existing strategy. And Russia has employed 4 nuclear weapons. Was that? Yes. The first 3 targets are destroyed. The 4th was a near miss. Now, NATO is left with the question of, is that all? Or might Russia employ more nuclear weapons tomorrow? Or a wider set of targets a week later? And what, if anything, can NATO do to prevent, well, as the usual formulation has it, to restore deterrence after it's once failed, and to de-escalate the war with some possibility of achieving an outcome that's consistent with the political interests of the members of the alliance. And so, as you see in the scenario, the political leadership of NATO asked the military leadership, the Supreme Allied Commander, to develop some strike options. He's only got 3 hours. In the real world, he probably wouldn't even have that much time. And here are 5 options, which are intended to tease out for you the different risks of Russian responses that would go with each. And the 5 options obviously range from a limited strike with 3 B-61s. So here an interesting question that's often debated in the game is, if the Russians cross the nuclear threshold with a small limited strike, they were probably expecting retaliation from NATO. And NATO promises that it would be proportionate retaliation. So if you want to shake Russia's confidence in its ability to manage nuclear escalation and cause it to not escalate further, maybe you have to come harder than proportionate. Maybe 3 is the wrong answer. Maybe 10 is the right answer. Maybe 20 is the right answer. But the question is not what's good for warfighting. That's a separate question. What's good for the strategic level of the game? What's good for convincing President Putin that he miscalculated, and if he goes further down this path, it's just going to get worse and worse for Russia. That's what deterrence requires. And we've got these 5 options in discussion. Can you plausibly believe that any of them isn't going to result in just the thing getting out of control? And the argument for the low yield option is, if all you're left with, if the only thing you have in your deterrence posture are the strategic forces of the United States, then their launch from U.S. strategic forces will certainly generate a Russian strategic response. So they don't make a credible threat as a response to limited Russian strikes. So the argument in the second move for the low yield option doesn't really have much to do with the yield at all. It has to do with the delivery system and the fact that it's not based in the continental United States. So here again, what nuclear actions do you recommend? How do you see the risks? And what comments do you have or thoughts about move 2? Spiro, then Josh.
So I was looking through these, and I was wondering why isn't a lower yield, and I guess like you said, yield doesn't matter at this point. Why is not a use of nuclear weapons on the kind of like the surrounding area of Kaliningrad and like that territory not an option? Because in that case, a nuclear attack would devalue the target, or will devalue Kaliningrad because it's no longer as useful if they don't have like their military base of operations there, and might deter them because if they're working to build a land bridge to Kaliningrad for strategic purposes, if we take out the strategic usefulness of Kaliningrad, then it might just it might convince them that, okay, well now Kaliningrad's going to need some time to be rebuilt to be strategic, so this might not be useful at this point in time.
Good comment. Josh, you want to comment too?
Yeah, I have a slightly different topic, but one thing that I wanted to discuss is like within these scenarios, there isn't really precedent set on like how you determine whether or not something is just initial strike or just like the first salvo of a continued strike. And so, I mean, the only time it's been dropped in history is the choice on Japan. And so there isn't really that way of determining, is this just a singular action or continued? So perhaps this is something that could be like referred back to like previous war games or information from like CIA and other stuff. But how do we determine whether or not Russia's strike is singular or just an opening salvo? And then how do we communicate what our actions are? Or is that even something we want to do? So I think that's kind of an interesting question to ask in these scenarios.
Well, that's right. And the fundamental dilemma for the players is there is no knowable answer to that question. The uncertainty is what you have to cope with as a player. And in the real world, that's the real thing. And it's probably true that Mr. Putin doesn't know what he's intending to do next. I mean, this would be an awfully high stakes game, and you know the best outcome from Mr. Putin's perspective is that he crosses this line and we just back down and he doesn't have to do anything more. He doesn't know what he's going to do next. He doesn't know what we're going to do next. He's probably persuaded him, if he's done move one, he's persuaded himself that the costs and risks are acceptable. And the benefits are must have. If he's gone to move two, he's making the same calculus. And that's why we try to influence that calculus by influencing the expected benefits, costs, and risks of different courses of action. Joe Gordon.
Yeah, I guess along that topic in communicating what our response is, I guess from some of the stuff I've read of like NATO's position on retaliation and I guess some of the modern US positions, it's supposed to be a proportionate response. So it would seem like if the US were to do a proportionate response to Russia's move two here, it would communicate that Russia's calculus that we would do a proportionate response was correct, and then, you know, establish kind of a playing field of rational actors there for both of us to continue moving forward.
Right, that's a good observation. And rather than have me comment, let's get Daniel into the discussion, then back to Spiro.
So if we communicate that the cost is mutually assured destruction with a massive atomic bomb, that would make no benefit worth going after, I feel. And like, I don't know. If it's a decision-making game, like he already dropped the bombs once, like we just want it to stop. Like any more is not good. So if the cost is just the worst case, then it might be enough of a deterrence.
Spiro.
So if Putin went into this attack, or like not this attack, but this offensive to create the land bridge to Kaliningrad, knowing that NATO's response to nuclear weapons was to do a proportional response, wouldn't then a proportional response be part of Putin's pre-calculated cost? So the only way to change his mind in his current game plan to go above a proportional response, because now it's higher than the intentional cost calculated, and he would have to redo his calculus throughout the whole process.
Yes. So where tabletop exercise like this should leave us is talking about move 0, not move 1, move 2, but what do you do in peacetime to set all of the conditions so that somebody who might actually sit down at the table and think about aggression against another country would go through this thinking process and conclude, these are all dead ends for me. There's nothing but trouble down all of these pathways. And to the comment just made by Daniel, let me come at it tangentially and say that the deterrence functions, when it does, on credibility and capability. And the United States would have the capability to strike Russia all sorts of ways without these low yield options, without NATO forward-based nuclear weapons. The issue isn't our capability. The issue is the credibility of our threat to do so. The reason we have 350 intercontinental ballistic missiles in the American heartland is for the credibility end of that discussion. In other words, we want to establish that our threat to retaliate if struck will be credible in the minds of an enemy contemplating the possibility of striking us. We want the threat to be credible. Now, if they're contemplating a strike on the American homeland, as opposed to a NATO ally or an Asian ally, imagine there were no ICBMs. There would be 2 ports where submarines are home ported, 3 air bases, 1 weapon storage area, and the submarines at sea. Roughly 7 to 10 aim points, where if struck, a lot of military people would die. And you wouldn't do it unless you thought you could get most of the submarines at sea with anti-submarine warfare. And then America's left with, let's say, a submarine full of ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons, which if fired would have a terrible impact on Russia. But Russia would still have essentially all of its nuclear weapons left. And what might then be left of America after Russia responded? Nothing. So imagine 350 ICBMs in the middle of the American heartland. If struck by, well, 700 missiles, what American president could say, oh, I might just not respond because it's too risky. No, if an enemy country launches and if it attacks 350 parts of the American heartland, as opposed to if it has to attack into the American heartland in large numbers, that's much more certain to generate an American nuclear response than is an attack at 7 aim points of military targets. The point is, forces get designed in order to bring credibility, not just capability. And the argument the advocates of the low yield option are making is that the threat to employ it is more credible in the eyes of our adversaries, in the eyes of Mr. Putin, because it's quote, more usable, which is of course what the advocates of disarmament find so offensive about it, that it's more usable. And this is the ironic situation with deterrence. But Daniel, you want to come back in the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, quickly, I think that's a great point. I mean, I wonder if a global stance, almost not embracing, but like a full acknowledgement of just if you know, obviously our military is very capable, but if the question is about credibility, we have militarily used 2 atomic bombs in the past. And I wonder if that's not held enough in global consciousness to be a credible enough deterrence on its own with you know, not many even, just like a few large scale nuclear bombs would be more effective at deterrence than several 100 nuclear warheads spread throughout the heartland.
Well, that's an important way to think about this. And from a deterrence perspective, I hope that others do bear in mind that history. I'm reminded of a paragraph on thermonuclear war by Herman Kahn, in which he said to the Soviets, look, these calculations we go through of our national interest in thinking through escalation patterns, what you Soviets really should understand about America is that we don't think that way. We genuinely believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we don't want to be bothered by the world until we are so bothered by it, we have to absolutely do something. We take our head out of the sand. And because we see the world in terms of good and evil, as opposed to interests, we are, if attacked, we are roused. What did he put it? If attacked, we are roused to use extravagant force to expunge a hated evil. So put that one into your deterrence calculus. How do you read American strategic behavior? Impossible to do. Well, that suggests that you don't provoke the bear because the bear is going to come get you. On the other hand, so we are the America of Pearl Harbor and 9/11, but we're also the America of Marine Barracks Lebanon and Vietnam and South Korea. Vietnam and South Korea, we fought to stalemates and sort of lost. And Marine Barracks Lebanon, was it 186 Marines were killed in a bombing, and President Reagan just brought everybody home, everybody who was left. So what worries me is that is the problem of 1939 and 40, when we had authoritarian leaders who realized the superior strength of the democracies militarily, but believed that our will was not sufficient to defend our interests if attacked. They looked at us as weak, easily divided, and led by weak people. And they calculated their ability to win war on the basis of our political character, not our military means. That, I think, is my personal. I supported the supplemental low yield capabilities of the Trump NPR, not because I think they add meaningful operational capability for fighting nuclear wars in Europe, but because they're a signal here and now, 4 years after the annexation of Crimea, so 2018, of our don't mess with me attitude. Mr. Putin, if you think you've been engaged in this buildup for 10 years and it's going to gain you any significant advantage over us, don't make the mistake. Yes, you've succeeded in dividing us with all your fancy electronic bots and money to presidential candidates and the like. Don't make the mistake of thinking that we aren't America of Pearl Harbor anymore. And that's the value of doing something that was politically unpopular. It sent a message. So let me make one closing argument, because I think we got 10 minutes left. And that's that when you think through the benefits and costs of the low yield option, the supplemental low yield option, think of 3 different metrics. Does the capability help to win in war by impressing upon our enemy decision makers that the costs and risks exceed the benefits of the action they're taking? Second metric, is the capability helpful in our coercion and counter-coercion strategies in crisis before war erupts? And thirdly, is the capability helpful in winning peacetime competition and assuring our allies? So to me, it seems that I think there are three different metrics for assessing these military capabilities. Nuclear weapons are supposed to serve political purposes above all, military purposes secondarily. And I invite you to think about all three. Aaron or Jake or Carl. Carl, you've been waiting, Carl.
Well, I just raised my hand right now. Being an old guy, I couldn't find the button for the yellow hand, so I have to use an analog rather than a digital hand here. So I wanted to draw you out on an issue. And I don't, in doing so, I don't want you to, in a certain sense, let the class off the hook and do their work for them. But it's an interesting question that I want a little bit of your reaction on. This was such a fascinating capstone that the GSIs and Michael and I have been talking about it, and we had an interchange the other day on one aspect of this. The two systems, the submarine launched cruise missile and the W76-2, a little bit different. The 76-2 was, I think, really brilliant because it was something that could be done very quickly, very economically, and in fact, the Defense Department, already announced I think a year ago that the SSBN Tennessee left port in late 2019 with, I think, at least 2 of the 16 tubes converted to 5 kiloton, sort of dumbed down weapons. Those can be done. I think in the future, you probably will not be getting weekly updates from the DoD on how many, where, and so forth. Allowed us to get something into play rather quickly and very quietly. I remember in your book, and I forget what strategist coined the term of you call them the nuclear queens. Like in a game of chess, the queen is the most powerful piece on the table, and it does not even need to move. It simply puts at risk practically everything else on the table. So in any theater combat, even if they're never used, they change the complete psychology. They change the play simply by the fact that they could be used even if they aren't. So the proposition I had tested Michael on is I said, well, since these things are so easy to do and have already gotten out so quickly, we really don't know how many more are there. Is opacity our friend or not? Opacity has been obviously, I think, Israel, of course, has been one that's been deliberately opaque. But I think, and for every reason, I think they're very credible. Michael scolded me for even breathing that because he thought opacity is just a terrible thing for the U.S. to adopt as, in a certain sense, a kind of a strategic value. On the other hand, the very fact that we have shown that we can deploy them, whether we deploy any more or not, no one knows exactly how many are at sea. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is this an effective nuclear queen or not? Again, I don't want you to do the work of the class for the next 10 weeks, but. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks. Is it an effective nuclear queen? Well, which is a separate question from opacity.
Right.
On opacity, I would just add that, I mean, we have been generally not opaque about capabilities. We are opaque about action. We have, I mean, the declaratory policy of every American president until potentially President Biden is calculated ambiguity. Mm-hmm. We leave it in the mind of the aggressor to try and figure out where our red line is, our nuclear red line. We want them to worry they can't calculate it. And now the adoption of the sole purpose formulation of declaratory policy might end that practice of opacity in a manner that I would find dangerous, but that's a separate point. And the argument against the low yield ballistic missile, one argument has been that for our for those who are able to see missiles coming, which at the moment is really only Russia, but will soon also be China, it'll be crucially important to know whether that's a conventionally armed ballistic missile, a nuclear armed ballistic missile, a high yield missile, low yield missile. And the fact that it's just a missile means that they're going to have to make a choice to ride out the arrival of that missile and then know what was coming at them, which they'll find very uncomfortable. But is the on my three line, my three metric, if those are the right three metrics, the value of the low yield SLBM in winning wars versus winning crises versus winning peacetime. I think there was a peacetime benefit to the initiative taken by the Trump administration. I think it was a necessary wake-up call to Mr. Putin that he wasn't going to be gaining significant strategic advantage through his nuclear modernization plan, and that reduces the risk of war in Europe. One. On coercion and crisis, I prefer that the president and the NATO has more options rather than fewer. So I think it's helpful. On winning in war, I don't think it makes much difference, because I think we have the technical means. So from my short, very thumbnail answer as to what we need in war, we need the ability to respond to one. We need the ability to respond to 3 to 5. We need the ability to, if they go another round with a few, we need to go another round. But we don't need, I mean, they can do it with anything. I mean, every strike system, aircraft, sea-launched, submarine, ground-based forces, every new delivery system built since 2008 can deliver either a nuclear weapon or a conventional weapon. We don't need all of that. We just need to be able to credibly threaten to retaliate at each of those thresholds, and that should give them the incentive to not cross that threshold. And I don't really see the addition of the low yield option as necessary for that purpose. I would much rather do it with NATO sharing arrangements.
Thank
So,
you.
Carl, that's my 3-minute answer to your.
Since we're at 28, I wanted to thank you. This is you. I don't know if you've been watching the chat, but you've done exactly what we hoped. You've really sparked a discussion, and you focused, I think, what the issues are. And I'm really looking forward to the next 10 weeks as our students really work this out, begin to refine their own positions, research them. And that I think this has produced exactly and thank you for the resources you gave us. I think this has really produced exactly what we wanted to kick off this capstone project. Michael, any comments from you?
No, I think it was very, very instructive. I would just urge students, particularly those who seem to be very leery of nuclear weapon use or even sort of anti-nuclear in their thinking, to try to jettison their feelings and focus on the concrete reality of the problem and put yourself in the position of a decision maker trying to make tough decisions facing an adversary who is also tough and pretty dangerous.
Yeah, I would just add one comment to that. Anybody who's actually engaged in nuclear planning is privately the most anti-nuclear person you will ever encounter. When you actually see what these weapons are capable of doing and contemplate the possibility that it's your finger on the button that's going to do that killing. I mean, this is why there's still such energy behind deterrence, because if this were just a warfighting problem, I mean, well, the implication of that statement's obvious. Well, I'm glad I stirred the pot. I'd be interested to see where you all come out at the end of this, the cooking of the pot that's been stirred. But I think I'm joining you later in the course for a a discussion of extended deterrence. So
Great.
that will bring us back to some of these questions undoubtedly.
Thank you, Brad. And
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Sorry to leave questions on the table, but we'll get to them another time.
Okay.
Great.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Roberts.
So much.
Thank you.